invitation. Thank you for turning up. I work at eLife, and these are the 4 things in the program, so I'm going to cover them. If I have time, there was 2 other things which sort of as an editor sort of figure largely on my mind, and I'll bring those up as well, but I say if there's time. So straight away, choosing the right journal. The first thing is, obviously there are thousands of journals, and they're all different in subtle and not so subtle ways. So some journals are run by all the editors, and all the decisions are made by academics who are active in research. Other journals, decisions are made by what's called professional editors, who are employees of the journals and who make initial decisions on the papers, and then they're refereed, and then the professional editor makes a decision based on the reports from the referees. eLife actually uses the former model. All our editors are actually, they work full-time as researchers, and they do some make editorial decisions as well. I'm a professional editor, so I'm full-time employed by eLife, so I don't actually decide on manuscripts, but in a previous life I was editor of Nature Nanotechnology for 6 or 7 years, and I was so did the other model as a professional editor, and making the initial decision on whether a paper goes out to review, and then making a decision based on the reports. So choosing the right journal. So first, a lot of this stuff is really, really obvious. So the scope. Some journals have very broad scope, and it would cover everything you might be interested in. The Journal of Theoretical Neuroscience clearly has a more limited scope. So you need to make sure, obviously, that you submit to a journal that is within scope, and look at and the obvious thing to do is go and look at the journal website. Nearly all journals say they want articles of broad appeal and appeal to readers outside the field. But the big Cell, Nature Science, etc., they really do want that appeal. Other journals less so. Next thing is article type. So that is, most papers are reporting original research results. They include data, they include analysis and interpretation, but there's a whole gamut of other types of papers. There are review articles. There's more sort of what's sometimes called, sometimes dismissively, methods papers, which don't describe a method but not actually new biology or new science. There are sort of opinion articles. There's commentary articles. So you have to, basically, but let's assume that what you have is an original research paper. So that should, unless it's a review journal, you will be covered by that. But even then, there are issues like if it's a negative result, or if you're countering a previously published result, you might sort of, journals have different attitudes on that as well. If you're challenging a result in that particular paper, there will be a track, technical comments in science, brief communications in Nature, which the journals frankly are reluctant to use. If you're publishing a negative result, what can I say? Good luck with that. the data shows that you need luck. So, but again, it's an obvious thing. Does the type of article that you've written, does it fit within that journal? And that's something, you don't want to waste time at the wrong journal because of that. Policy on open access. More and more funders, it's a condition of being funded that you take an open access route and with your publications. There's lots of ways to do that, and journals obviously don't want to turn away good papers, so more and more that's not really something you'd almost always be okay, but it's something you should check if your funder has particular. They might have, so open access, when you're looking at there's different types of licenses, the copyright, the Creative Commons, and what sort of, is it NC or not NC, and share alike, blah blah blah. So you don't want to get tripped up and wasting a lot of time and things like that. So that's something to check. Acceptance rates. The most selective journals are very selective. They publish less than 10% of their papers. So so you need to bear that in mind when you're choosing a journal. If basically, do you think you have a chance of being accepted? If you don't, I would suggest move on. Time and speed are something to consider. Some journals have a reputation for being fast. Some journals have a reputation for being slow. Some journals have a reputation for wanting revisions, and then they want the revision revised, and it actually, from submission to publication, even if you are successful, can take over a year, can take over 2 years. So again, if you don't have much time or are in a hurry, that is something you might want to think about as well. The last thing, prestige reputation. I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. I'm not going to prejudge what people might think on this. Obviously, there are some journals everyone wants to get into, and we want eLife to be one of those journals. It's not one yet, but it's a fact of life. So the cover letter. As I say, look at the journal website. Again, there's a lot of similarities between journals, but there are subtle differences, and I say you don't want to get sort of stuck because of subtle differences. I just, preparing this talk, I randomly looked at lots of journal websites. Some of them give quite lots of details on a cover letter. Some of them didn't mention the cover letter at all. Certainly, I couldn't find it in their information for authors, and some it was sort of fairly sketchy. But there are, when you're thinking about a journal, another thing to think about is, for example, pre-submission inquiries. Some journals allow pre-submission inquiries. You can save yourself a lot of time if you just send in which is basically an abstract and a quick explanation of what it is about and are they interested or potentially interested or not. But some journals, Current Biology actually prefers you to send in a pre-submission inquiry. So again, look at the website and just see what way the journal operates regards to pre-submission inquiries, cover letters. If there's no information about cover letters on the site, there's a few standard things you want to put in, what I would call to begin with, the facts and figures or the formalities, the title of the paper, the number of words, the number of figures, the contact detail, emails and phones, etc., for the authors. You need to provide an assurance that it's not been published anywhere, indeed not been submitted anywhere. Submitting a journal, the same article to two journals at the same time, is a mild form of misconduct, and it's not something you should do. It's fine to send in some, inquiries parallel, but once you've submitted it's just a bad thing to, because it takes up people's time being considered, and if people are spending time reading it and thinking about it and replying to you, and you've actually got someone else doing the same thing, that's just not on, basically. You have to say all the authors approve the submission. If you have publications of your own that are in preparation or have been submitted elsewhere or have been accepted elsewhere that are germane to the manuscript submitted to the journal, you should mention those, and quite often you have to actually provide copies so that the referees or the editors can see them and figure out how the manuscript they're considering fits into the literature. It might be, of other groups that are working on the same field, competing groups. You might want, that's sort of optional whether you mention that in the cover letter or not. It's sometimes, if you're in a field and it's quite friendly and everyone's interested in moving the field as a whole forward, they will say, actually, we're submitting this, and Professor X at Berlin, we've talked to him or her and she's doing similar work, and we're going to submit them together. But other times it will be, we're aware of competitive work and we're in this mad dash and we want you to expedite peer review, i.e., so there's friendly competition and unfriendly competition. But again, that's the sort of thing that a cover letter is a natural place to put it. And competing interests, always mention those. A lot of these things, now submission systems are sort of web-based forms, and you'll be asked to tick boxes and cover these things. But it never does any harm to mention the really important ones or the unusual ones in the letter. Then, the really important bit, the scientific content. And this is, what you want to do is whet the appetite of the editor or who's going to, making a decision basically whether your paper is going to be peer reviewed or not. So you need to give some background to the problem and explain why the question was even interesting in the first place. And then summarize, explain your answer and why it could be potentially important or significant. But this is very important, do not oversell it, because that's something is just the competition for grants and publications and jobs becomes more and more intense. There is this tendency to oversell results, and it sort of, you don't do yourself any favors ultimately by overselling. Something else you can either do by forms or in the cover letter is suggest referees or exclude referees. When you're suggesting referees, don't just suggest big, in your field, if you only suggest Michael Levitt and Cyrus Churia, people will think, Christ, they've got a very high opinion of themselves, and and if lots of people only ever suggest the same number of small experts, I think there's a chance you won't be taken seriously if you think the only people capable of judging your work are these really big name Nobel Prize winners. So be realistic about who it is you think, and also it's actually practical help to the journal if actually your paper is in a fairly specialized area or a new area, which they may not have experience in handling submissions in. Genuinely people qualified to referee in that area is a real godsend to the editors, so please do that. You can also exclude names. If you exclude too many names, again, it starts to look bad. When I was in Nature Nano, I once had an exclusion. We don't want anyone from Stanford, just the entire Stanford University to, and that just, again, that seems suspicious and odd. You wonder what's behind that. Responding to reviews, those of you who are eagle-eyed will notice what it said in the write-up. It said rebutting reviewers, and I felt rebutting reviewers sends the wrong message. It sends sort of an idea of it's confrontational and it's a disagreement. Okay, some reviewers are bastards, you can't argue with that, but by and large they're not, and they've spent a lot of time and thought, and you sometimes read the reports and the sort of insight in what they contain is remarkable. So if you get a report from the referees, generally the best format is just to, in your letter responding to it, repeat verbatim the point, concern, criticism, whatever made by the referee. Respond to it as this is a good point, we overlooked it, blah, 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 blah. Explain what your explanation for what it is, and then say, we have revised the manuscript by including a new figure or doing something to figure 6 or revising, adding a new reference or removing a reference or rewording or what have you. And just go through point by point doing that. If you disagree with what they've said, which is perfectly fine, you just say, with respect, we disagree with this for the following reasons, or we actually did this and the referee suggests some experiments. It could be we've done this and actually it didn't work, or this is what happened, or that's what happened, or what have you. It might be that it's a request for an experiment that you think is ridiculous, and you just explain, with all the time in the world and infinite resources, yes, we would like to do that, but we feel our story conclusions stand up as they are, or what have you. So you don't have to do everything the referees request, but you have to explain in a patient and reasonable manner if you think the referees are misguided, for want of a better word. And then you just move on to the next criticism, concern, do the same again, and although you might find it difficult, just remain professional and reasonable, and don't get snarky and don't make little snide comments, and don't question how much or how little the referee knows about it, because you're just, again, not doing yourself any favours. It wasn't put on the list of things to cover, but appealing is sort of in a way, so responding to reviews like this, in a way you've got the thumbs up, you have a chance of publication, you just have to negotiate your way through to the next stage. If you're rejected, you can consider appealing that. Basically, if it's a rejection without peer review, basically what you're doing is the editors have said, if it's out of scope, there's not much point arguing. The editor knows the scope of his or her journal. It might be that you just disagree. You think somehow that the editor hasn't understood the significance or the importance of your work, and you can have a go at explaining it again in more detail. But chances, and you might be successful, you might not. It's one of those things that as an editor, when I used to write those desk rejections, you always wanted to put enough detail in your letter to make your decision stick. You didn't want to put in too much detail to give the author something to argue with. And if you weren't sure, I always like to hold one bullet back, that if they did appeal, that I would say this is yet another reason not to for the decision. You can also get a peer review, and you might think that the reports were actually broadly favourable, concerns you could deal with, and for some reason it's been rejected. So in those cases, again, just write in this reasonable manner, explaining, you're disappointed, surprised. The main stumbling block seems to be this. You're confident that you can address whatever this stumbling block or stumbling blocks are. And again, editors do reverse their decisions. Papers that have been rejected before peer review, after peer review, do get published. So it's one of those things. Obviously, it slows things down, and you have a risk that a month will pass and you'll be still where you were to begin with. But if you genuinely feel that they've made an error, it is worth appealing. Dealing with the press. So, as we're in Dublin, ask yourself, would the Irish Times be interested in this paper? I.e., the man or woman on O'Connell Street, would they be interested in this? If they are, you can sort of move it forward. If they're not, you need to act accordingly. If you think you really got a good story that'll appeal to the press, generally the best thing to do is contact the press office at your institution. Give them plenty of time, because they handle lots of academics and they like, it takes time to get the material interested in. If the journal has a press office, which the big journals do, you should put the two press offices in contact with each other, because all the practicalities about publication dates and embargoes and contact details and press releases and who circulates to who, you're much better not worrying about that. Let the professionals, just get on with that. If it does get to the stage where you have a press release, you must use everyday language, not the language you use in research papers. Equally, you must avoid hype. You don't want to, not every paper is a cure for cancer or guarantees food security for the all the time. And photographs, visuals, videos, stuff like that always help. Other things you can do, I would back up what Mick Watson said earlier on. Just there's no harm in tweeting and blogging about stuff. There might be a small number of people who follow you or read similar blogs, will be interested in your work, and Twitter and social media is a very good way to reach people without sort of being mediated or going through conventional media. If it goes well and there's a press release being issued, make yourself available to talk to journalists and actually explain as clearly as you can what it is you've done. Accept that this will take time, and otherwise there's not much point doing it. If you are, funny, I wrote this before, I didn't know about the whole bullet point situation, but if you are being interviewed, just think of 3 things that you want to get across about your research and work them in, whether it's, if you're asked a question which you don't think you can give a meaningful answer to, but you can slip in your answer to one of your 3 bullet points, just do that. And just what are the 3 things, if you read a story about your research, would you like to read in it? And try and get those across during the interview. Okay. Oh, I've run a minute over. I'll just tell you the 2 things that I don't have time to cover. Careers, hyper competition for jobs and grants. I think it's just, and this is a career sort of meeting, so it's an absolutely colossal issue in the life and biomedical sciences at the minute. And reproducibility, as someone else had mentioned, is someone who works as an editor, it's probably the thing that worries me most at the minute, this sort of looming reproducibility crisis. And it's interesting, you might think, why is there so much of it in biology? And you've got wet labs and you've got living things and you've got this shocking heterogeneity of everything's different. And you might think, well, you're on your computers, everything's repeatable. But there's a woman shaking her head, and she is quite right. It is not repeatable. And I think the issues are just as challenging in computational science as they are in other areas as well. So thank you for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so we made sure that we have ample time for questions and discussions. So, anyone? Thomas?
What's the balance between pushing back against reviewers and actually giving in to the demand of the additional pile of work that they think is necessary to make remotely readable?
I think there's a general feeling overall that sort of endless demand for new experiments has gone too far, and it is counterproductive, and it's wasting everyone's time, and it's writing the paper that the referee wants to read rather than the paper that the person who spent 3 years worrying about this problem has did their best to do it. So it's one of those. Obviously, there are some cases where you've already done the experiment. In the time that the paper's been at the referees, you've done the experiments and you have them there. There's sometimes they say you've done them and not included them in the paper because somehow they didn't fit in the report. Sometimes they are genuinely insightful things that the referee have thought of, which the authors haven't thought of. And if they can be done in a month or 2, everyone benefits. The authors benefit from having a much better, more robust paper. But if it's something that sends you back to the lab for 18 months, I think you just you have to fight that unless you somehow think, actually, this piece of work needs that extra, and I'm willing to do, you know, and whatever, because of the circumstances you're in and the resources you have available, you can do it. But if, you know, I would say if there's a massive amount of extra work done, you should push back about it or just go to another journal.
More questions, yeah?
How much can you kind of reveal about a paper's contents in conferences and things like that beforehand? That's the balance.
There's an awful lot of, well, I suppose there's two issues there. One is the, what you reveal to your competitors. So you stand up here and you show something and you haven't published it and someone else just runs away and does the experiment quicker than you can, and you know, so you don't want that to happen. So that's something, that's up to you to sort of figure out what you're comfortable with releasing with a view to getting your own publications out. There is a fear among academics, which I think is unfounded, that journals are constantly looking to trip people up for breaking embargoes and things like that. And I don't know of a single example where something like that has happened. You know, I feel it really is this old wives' tale. Journals will all tell you, we don't want to, you've got this big, hopefully big, lively, thriving scientific community interacting and competing and cooperating and communicating with each other and exchanging ideas in the hope that this will sort of foster progress. And journalists don't want to be getting in there saying you can't talk to him or her because somehow we think our journal will suffer at the end. So as I say, if I'd be worried about letting your rivals, you know your best ideas sooner than ideal. But I think journals don't really. But the one thing that they don't want, you know, if you get your paper accepted and it's scheduled for publication on a certain day, there's a sort of embargo introduced, and you do want to go flouting that, you know, willfully. But if you're just going about your normal, you know, if you phone up a journalist and tell them, you know, you're doing it in an active, sort of quite unnatural way. But if you're just talking to your colleagues and competitors and telling them, talking science, journals are perfectly happy with that.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what happens in the process of getting some reviews back, you reading over the reviews and then deciding whether you will accept some revisions or not? Like, what happens?
Okay, well, when I was at, you know, journals, when I was a professional editor, it was done very differently. To, you know, one of the, I'm going to mention eLife, but I think because it genuinely figures in the answer to that question. But generally, you know, the editor gets the reports in and they read the reports and they just think, you know, is it thumbs up or thumbs down? And are the referees excited? Do they think it's important? Do they think it's done correctly? And you know, so it's fairly simple. And you might, you know, if you have a 2 versus 1 situation, nearly always what happens is that you've got some reports are better than others in the sense that they are more useful for helping you to make a decision. You might have a very cursory, this is great work, you'll just publish it as it is, which is almost useless to an editor, just as useless as, you know, this is a pile of shit, you know, don't touch it with a barge pole. And you just, you know, those are extremes, but you know, whereas you get a sort of a page or two of reasoned argument telling you about the strengths and weaknesses. And I honestly think any scientist faced with those reviews, or enough of them, would end up reaching roughly the same decision as an editor would reach. You know, the papers that are good will, you know, go through the next stage and be published, and the papers that aren't will be declined. What we do at eLife is slightly different in that sense, in that when the last referee report comes in, all the referees get sent an email saying, everyone has now, all 3 referees have now reported in this paper, and it tells the referees who the other referees are. So they get to read the other report and they know who wrote it. And then there's this online consultation starts where the person called the reviewing editor, who's sort of in charge of the reviewing process, says, you know, what do you think of each other's reports? And someone will say, oh, I agree with everything that so-and-so said, or I agree with this, but I think it's unrealistic to ask them to, you know, to do that experiment. And you have this sort of online discussion where they sort of, especially if the paper's going to be rejected, it's fairly clear that they'll just say, yeah, this is, we don't think there's scope for publishing this paper. But if it's a paper that they would like to publish, but it still needs work on it, there's a sort of a discussion to agree on this, you know, the few things that must be done to get the paper accepted. And so it might be that each referee has made 5 concerns, and these are all combined into a letter. But some of them, they might all agree, actually that's asking too much, we won't ask them to do this, we will ask them to do that. And the idea is to come up with a list of things that can be done in a reasonable time, and if they're all done, the paper will be accepted without going through another arduous review process.
So I worked together with a professor, and we submitted this paper, and then it was rejected, and then the professor, oh, I'm gonna call the editor.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
What I always used to say in those situations was that it's all very well, there seems to be certainly some professors, and I think there's some institutions, and there's this almost, they're a bit like, they're trained like professional sports people. Some sports people always seem to dispute the referee's decision. It doesn't matter, and they just think over the course of a game, they'll get something, they'll slightly shift it, if not in that particular paper or in that particular game, but over the course of their career, they will do slightly better because they've contested every referee's decision, and that may well be true. I think, you've got to be reasonable, and don't shout. It's best to phone up and agree. But what I used to always say in situations like that is that the paper really has to speak for itself. If you have to phone up and explain to me why the paper is important, and you've somehow, the paper itself is deficient, that the paper didn't do that, and the referees and the editors all somehow in their combined wisdom either it did it and they were too stupid to see it, but more likely it didn't do it. So I think it's one of those things. I think that sort of phone contact with increasing electronic contact is becoming rarer and rarer, and as long as it's done, if every decision, if they phone up after every time a decision goes their way, that will be counterproductive. Yeah. If it's reserved for the cases where somehow genuinely the professor feels that the paper hasn't got a fair shake, it might work. But I say you have to be reasonable and professional, and the paper has to speak for itself in the end.
That's a good point. Final question before we go to Carl.
You mentioned the concern about not sending the same work to multiple journals.
Yeah.
I'm wondering on a related note, if you wanted to have a conference proceedings version and then an extended journal version or archive, or sort of there's multiple different venues and so
Yeah.
Can you speak something about that?
That's a bit of a grey area in that, because there's some fields where conference, the premier publication venue is a particular conference or a handful of conferences. Most of the life sciences, it's journals, but I know in the more engineering computational fields, conferences do have greater prestige in certain areas. It's always, and it sort of there's a couple of rules of thumb, but I wouldn't say any of these things are cast iron. One is, if something has been peer reviewed to get published in a conference proceedings, that makes it look very much like it's been published. If it's a preprint that's been put up on archive or bioarchive or something like that, it's not been peer reviewed, it doesn't have a DOI. Those are also quite mainstream, and most journals will either say they do consider or they don't consider publication on that, those well-known archives, to compromise the way it's treated at the journal. If it's a conference, and if the figures and if it's an abstract with several figures and data that appeared at the conference and then some sort of publication after the conference or during the conference, it's sort of it's a grey area. And if you think it's really good work, you'd want to be sure. If you want to publish it somewhere else, you would need to think about that first before actually including it in the abstract. If it's just a conference, you get up and you show the results and you talk and explain everything and it's out in the open, that doesn't compromise in any way. But if it looks like a publication with a DOI, or if it's been refereed, it may well compromise.
Can I just retort to that? I'm a computer scientist.
Yeah.
And I was also a journal editor for the major journal in semantic web for 7 years. And it's different in computer science. And many of you are informaticians, so you will publish in computer science or could potentially publish in computer science. There, the conferences are really prime publishing publishing mechanisms. They have highly refereed, better refereed, I would say, than many of the journals, because it's a one-shot. You don't have this long discussion. They have DOIs, they have everything, and yet you still publish paper in journals. There's just clearly described rules about the novelty of the material that you add to the paper. There has to be a certain, so only, there could be a journal that says 50% of the material has been new, or it has been much more deeply described in the 8 pages that you have in the conference proceedings. So particularly for those of you I know who do sort of highly computing orientated things, it's a bit different for computer science.
All right, I think that's it for now. So let's thank Peter Rodgers again for being